Stone is helping himself. He's selling books. Imagine that, Roger. The Washington Post criticizing somebody for selling information, which is supposed to be the business that they're in, but they're really kind of in the propaganda business.
They're fundamentally opposed to the concept of free enterprise.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not on the government payroll, so I do have to make a living to feed the extensive Stone family. Not only do I have my relatives, my wife's relatives, but an enormous muspuka of cats and dogs. So, you know, a lot of dog food in our house.
And a pretty cool car that you just got recently.
Yes, I picked up an old 1972 Citroen DS21 station wagon with 72,000 miles on it. I had one of these cars when I lived in Washington. One of the greatest cars ever made.
It's an interesting car.
Very hard to keep on the road. Very hard to keep on the road because it has a hydraulic fluid-based system of shocks. So you have to be both a plumber and a mechanic to keep this on the road. And
your average Jim Bob down the street is not going to be able to work on that or find parts if he could.
No, ironically, the very best mechanics for these things, David, are tend to be Asians because the French were in Indochina. There are a lot of these cars in that part of the world. So, you know, I finally found a Vietnamese mechanic who's a genius, and he's still going to help me keep this on the road.
And maybe he can get parts flown in from Indonesia.
Parts are actually findable. That's the good news. Yeah,
that's interesting.
You got to have them sent from France, of course. Yeah, not so bad.
That's interesting. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting is as they come after you, and their narrative, of course, the Russians did it and everything. Now they're gradually starting to come out. We have this article from The Hill. Obama thought that Clinton's handling of the email server was, quote, political malpractice. As I said earlier, that's the reason that people hire people like you is to bring these politicians like Hillary Clinton who have spent decades getting away with lying to the public and telling them, you know what, this lie really isn't flying anywhere. Maybe we should be a little bit more candid about what's going on here or try to talk some reason into them.
Yeah, no, it's hubris, I guess. When you get away with substantial crimes over a 30, 40-year period, you begin to believe you're bulletproof, that you're invulnerable. Beyond that, of course, Hillary's entire raison d'etre here was, it's my turn. Just give this to me. It's my turn. She didn't even feel she needed to campaign, and she didn't campaign much. Of course, when she did campaign, she had trouble getting a crowd of more than 200 or 300 people. You could read between the enormous crowds that Trump was getting and the dominance at that time on social media of the Trump people, you could see anecdotally, perhaps not scientifically, that the Trump tsunami was coming. The mainstream media didn't see it, but we here at InfoWars saw it, and the folks at Breitbart and Daily Caller and so on. Yeah, it was malpractice, but I think they thought right till the end they could stonewall it, as they say, and get away with it.
Yeah, yeah. They're still kind of drinking their own Kool-Aid in the sense, so you look at this Georgia election, and as they poured all of these resources, Hollywood personalities, $8.3 million into this small election in Georgia, and volunteers coming from all over the country, moving there to live there, they still couldn't pull it out, even against a divided field of Republicans, as a Republican district.
Yes.
Still couldn't pull out a 50-point victory, but they're talking as if they got some kind of a victory there. I don't think... I don't know. Do you see that as a victory? Or
no,
I
really don't. You know, in politics, it doesn't matter whether you win by 1 vote or 500,000 votes. Victory is victory and defeat is defeat. We've now had 2 House special elections since the election of Donald Trump, and they have lost both of them. By the way, they spent more resources in terms of raw dollars in both of them that we did. And candidly,
about 3 times what the Republicans did. The Republicans came in late. They were focusing all of their resources on this one guy, Ossoff, and the Republicans came in and did like $3 million, which is about 1/3 of what they did, talking about the influence of outside money.
Yeah,
because they had so many Republican candidates. They didn't focus on anyone.
You're right about the fact that the Republicans caught on to all of this late, and they got in late. There was some real concern late among party professionals that I spoke to in the last 2 weeks that we were too focused on Kansas, not focused enough on Georgia, but obviously came out all right.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll see what happens probably in this next election.
The other thing I find interesting here is the Variety cover of Chelsea Clinton. Obviously, if that's the political legacy of the Clintons, I think they're in deep trouble. She's not terribly bright. Personally, people I know who know her, and of course a number of stories, including the New York Post, talk about how epically abusive she is, foul-mouthed, nasty, greedy, very much like her mother. And people who like her people who have met her don't like her. Some discussion of her moving to a suburban New York City district and running for Congress out in Westchester, probably the district, the seat now held by Congresswoman Nita Lowey. I spoke last night to Danny Williams, the abandoned son of Bill Clinton.
Yes.
If should she run for Congress, Danny will move to that district and will challenge her in the Democratic primary. The district is about 40% African-American in the Democratic primary. Could be very interesting.
Good for him. Good for him.
No, he's a fighter.
He just only has to get near that district, kind of like Ossoff did, right? Ossoff is not even in his district. So
we're to a point now where, as you know, legally, all you got to do is live in the district by the time you're sworn in. You don't even have to live in the district at the time you run, and there's nothing really keeping him in Arkansas other than the upcoming paternity suit that he's going to be filing against the former president, something that should have been done a long time ago. Unfortunately, somebody gave him bad legal advice and told him that a paternity suit would only work prior to his being 21 years old, and that's not true. The legal underpinnings are still there, and you know, there's two ways to do this. He could challenge this question in the courts. He could wait until the former president passes away, and if he is not provided for in the will, I have a feeling he won't be, he could challenge the will. Here's the point. Danny Williams has 5 kids. He's working in a meat packing plant by day, working at a 7-Eleven at night to make ends meet. His father's worth between $300 and $400 million. It's time for justice in this case, in my view.
Yeah, you know, he could... at the very least, if Bill Clinton doesn't think that he's the father, and just as a courtesy, you would think that he would do this to put Danny at ease and say, look, I'm not, let me prove it. I'll do it. But I think he thinks that he is the father, which is why he won't do a paternity test.
Well, he knows he's the father. That's why he was sending Christmas presents to Danny. That's why he was providing cash payments to his mother at the top of every month from the time of Danny's birth until the time he became president.
Sending the highway patrol to make those deliveries?
Exactly. Yeah. And as you know, we located and interviewed 2 retired Arkansas state troopers who both said that in alternate years they made deliveries to the house. So it's time for Bill Clinton to do the right thing.
Absolutely. Let's talk about doing the right thing here on 420 Day, because we have a lot of news about marijuana legalization. Of course, Canada is talking about they're introducing legislation to fully legalize marijuana. I think the interesting thing about this, as we look at it, is how this might proceed. And I think Canada shows us an example. They're talking about how they've had 90 years of prohibition, but they say despite decades of criminal prohibition, Canadians, including 21% of our youth, 30% of young adults, continue to use cannabis at among the highest rates in the world. In other words, it doesn't work, and we know that. And we've seen the failure of alcohol prohibition. We've seen the success of educating people about tobacco. We've seen tobacco use plummet, mainly because of education. Yes, they have outlawed it in airplanes and restaurants and things like that. I think that should have been handled by the businesses themselves. As a matter of fact, before they outlawed it on airplanes, you might remember there were some small carriers that said we're not going to have any smoking on our flights. And so people could make a market choice about that. You can make a market choice about going to a restaurant or a bar based on whether or not there was smoking there. But other than that, for the most part, they took an educational approach towards tobacco, and it was successful. Prohibition didn't work with alcohol, and it hasn't worked with marijuana or any of these other drugs that they prohibited. But we have had a massive blowback in negative effects in terms of law enforcement abuse, in terms of prisons that have filled up, in terms of civil asset forfeiture and these other things.
Look, I think everybody knows that I am that Richard Nixon, the former president, was my mentor. But the war on drugs, I think, is his largest single error, with the possible exception of taking us off the gold standard. The war on drugs has been an expensive, ignominious failure. We're not rehabilitating anyone. We have the enormous cost of housing, entire generation of young African-American men for the nonviolent crime in many states of possession. And I think Donald Trump really started to lead the way in the campaign when he said, look, this is a states' rights issue.
Yes.
If the states want to legalize marijuana for medicinal purposes, It's up to the states.
That's a 10th Amendment approach. That's a constitutional approach.
And I think that many libertarian voters, many younger voters in the end voted for Donald Trump based on that assurance. Now we have Attorney General Jeff Sessions, a man who I like, a guy that I admire, but suddenly he is talking about prosecuting, or I should say enforcing federal marijuana laws for which there's been a general stand down in those 8 states that have approved recreational marijuana. Well, you can't be for states' rights when it comes to transgendered bathrooms, and be for states' rights when it comes to abortion, and be for states' rights when it comes to medicinal marijuana, and now say, well, I'm not for states' rights when it comes to recreational marijuana. The process is identical. In many of these states, it takes more than 60% for it to be approved. I think, in all honesty, Attorney General Sessions is doing a disservice to the president. I think he is pursuing a policy that is inconsistent with what the president said during the campaign. I'm going to be working with a fellow named Derek Kitts, putting together a coalition in the 8 states that provide for recreational marijuana to persuade the president that they're headed in the wrong direction on this issue.
Absolutely. I agree with you. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we come back. Stay with us. I'm David Knight. We were talking to Roger Stone. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight with Roger Stone. We're going to talk a little bit more about prohibition, because today is 420 Day, and a lot of people across the country are celebrating marijuana use. If that's your thing, I don't want to lock you up. It's not my thing. I don't use marijuana. I don't use alcohol. It's my choice. But I don't want to beat, imprison people, and I don't want to pay for them to be imprisoned. I don't want to pay for families to be separated. And I don't want to have a system that encourages our law enforcement to act like thieves in order to fund their purchases with civil asset forfeiture. So I don't want to see that kind of thing happening. I'm against that on a legal basis, on a pragmatic basis, and quite frankly, it just doesn't work if you want to look at it from a pragmatic basis. Before we get back to that, and I want to talk to you, Roger, about your the documentary that Netflix did on you that's going to be premiering this weekend. I want to get you to tell people about that. I think it's kind of interesting. They've followed you around for a very long time with that. But before we do, real quickly, we have extended our Mega Easter specials at InfoWarsStore.com. You'll see a wide variety of products available there at 25 to 30% off. 25% off things like Super Male, Super Female Vitality, Survival Shield X2 Nascent Iodine, 25% off. Secret 12, our vitamin B12 formulation that you can take sublingually. You just put a couple of drops under your tongue instead of having to take an injection. You get the same benefit. That's Secret 12, vitamin B12. And all those are 25% off. And we have 30% off Brain Force. Take a look at the specials that we have there. We've extended it for people by popular demand, and we do appreciate you standing with us. It is getting increasingly difficult for us to fund the operation because of the pushback by Google trying to censor our newsletter, our news that goes out. If you try to forward that on social media or try to find it on Google search engines, and also trying to keep us from putting our ads on other people's sites or accepting ads onto our site. So they're coming at us in every possible direction. So we really do appreciate you supporting us, and you can go to InfoWarsStore.com. Help yourself, help us with those fine products now available at 25 to 30% off. Now, Roger, I see that your documentary, the documentary about you that's being done by Netflix, they followed you around for how long did they follow you around?
5 years. This was 5 years in the making. There's a kind of a bite there of the trailer. Now, I've only seen the trailer. I haven't seen the full documentary, but it debuts. The premiere is at the Tribeca Film Festival this Sunday. Then there'll be 4 showings in New York City next week. Then it will be available to Netflix subscribers in May 12th.
You must be going
it's
through...
entitled Get Me, Roger Stone. There was a secret showing for the press last night where I had a couple quislings who tell me that it's pretty balanced, that it's pretty good. So I'm pretty excited.
Good, good. I'm interested in seeing it. But they're following you around for 5 years. You must be suffering from empty nest syndrome, not having a film crew.
Well, this started when 3 college students approached me, and these guys looked like they were in ZZ Top. I mean, they lived in Williamsburg. They were hipsters. And they said, we want to make this documentary about you. And I said, well, what do you need from me? They said, we just need your cooperation. And we need you to agree not to do any other documentary in this period while we make ours. Seemed reasonable. I asked them about their budget. They said, well, we think we could do this for $125,000. And I said, well, how much of that do you have? Well, we don't have any of it, they said, but we're confident that we can raise it. So then what would happen is they would raise a small amount of money. They would come, we'd do some intensive interviews. Then they would disappear for 6 months. Then they would come back, raise a little more money. We'd do a little more. Now, politics changed dramatically in those 5 years. The rise of Donald Trump, the extraordinarily historic outcome of last year's election. So during this 5-year period, the focus of the documentary changed dramatically. The president, to my great relief and gratitude, agreed to be interviewed for the documentary, as did many other, office holders and journalists and others that I had come across in my lifetime. It does kind of hurt my feelings that they interviewed the late Senator Arlen Specter for the documentary, but I think he ended up on the cutting room floor.
Oh.
I'm anxious to see it, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, it's kind of interesting that this would stretch out over a 5-year period, because that gives it a very interesting perspective. Like you talk about everything changing so much over that period of time, but you don't usually have films or documentaries that stretch out over that length of time. What was it? Linklater did that film with his actors over a 12-year period.
Yes.
But this is a 5-year documentary. That's going to be pretty cool. I'm looking forward to see that. Stay with us. We're going to take a quick break, and I'll be right back. David Knight with Roger Stone, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the politics of legalization. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight with Roger Stone. I'm going to get back and look at the comments being made by various members of the administration about marijuana laws. We've got the Attorney General, we've got Homeland Security, we've got the new drug czar, Tom Marino, all of them making very interesting comments on this this week, where we're celebrating, many people are celebrating the use of marijuana on 420. Before we get to that, real quickly, another side issue here, Roger, I want to get your comments on. We've got a story that just went up on Infowars.com. Nigel Farage says he's considering running as prime minister, because we've had these special elections called by Prime Minister May, saying that she wants to consolidate. There's a lot of division within the government as to how they're going to move forward on Brexit. So this is starting to turn into a Brexit referendum. And, of course, nobody would be better suited for that than Nigel Farage. What do you think?
I just don't. The problem, of course, is you don't run for prime minister. Your party runs candidates for local constituencies.
That's
and
true.
If you win a majority, then the party caucus chooses the prime minister, who's almost always the already selected party leader. I like Nigel Farage. He's a friend of mine, but I don't know how he would fare in what is a very insider system. Now,
so even if he were, exactly, that's right. Like you said, they don't have a direct election of prime minister. He would have to have a majority of UKIP people,
right,
and he would have to win a seat, and then they would pick him as their prime minister.
Now, maybe you could run for your local seat, making it clear that if I am elected, I would support Nigel Farage for prime minister, but that even that would be antithetical to their current system, that these decisions are usually made after the election. People vote for the party more than they vote for the person at the constituency level, understanding that if the party wins, the party leader, who is well known, would become the PM.
And we saw that happen when Theresa May became prime minister. They had a succession of people that everybody thought was going to be prime minister. They thought Boris Johnson was going to be there. They thought other people were going to be selected as a prime minister. They were one by one taken out of the running, and she wound up being the prime minister. So even if your party is in the majority, the person that appears to be the leader at a given time doesn't necessarily ascend to that post.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's go to a comment that Homeland Security Secretary Kelly said. Now, he had gone on a Sunday show on NBC News. He told Chuck Todd that, quote, marijuana is not a factor in the drug war. Then he felt that he needed to strengthen this position. There's a lot of blowback, evidently, within the administration or politically. So he came back with this statement.
Let me be clear about marijuana. It is a potentially dangerous gateway drug that frequently leads to the use of harder drugs. Additionally, science tells us it is not only psychologically addictive, but can have profound negative impacts on the still developing minds of teens and people up into their mid-20s. Beyond that, however, its use and possession is against federal law, and until the law is changed by the United States Congress, we in DHS, along with the rest of the federal government, are sworn to uphold all the laws that are on the books.
So there we go. That's his Reefer Madness reply.
Wow. What planet does this gentleman live on? First of all, marijuana is not a gateway drug. This has been disproved. No one believes that. I mean, David, one puff and you're immediately a heroin addict.
And you wear real old-fashioned clothes like Reefer Madness.
I mean, if that were true, obviously,
really
given the enormous number of people who do utilize and use marijuana, we would be up to our elbows in heroin addicts, which we're not. This guy lives in 1960. That is inconsistent with the president's views. This is deeply concerning, but I do think he hit upon one important thing, which is if Attorney General Sessions continues and moves in the direction of enforcing federal law only in those areas where recreational marijuana has been approved by the states, he will force the Congress to legalize marijuana. And we are getting closer and closer to having the numbers to do that. A coalition of liberal Democrats and liberty-minded Republicans, we're very close, at least in the House, of being able to have complete legalization.
You know,
that will be the results of draconian crackdown and enforcement of the current law. And by the way, under a Justice Department memo, we are standing down currently on the enforcement of that law. Perhaps the Secretary's unaware of that.
You know, Ulysses Grant said the best way to get rid of a bad law is to rigorously enforce it.
Yes.
And that's exactly what you're talking about doing here. You know, it's interesting because in the years that I've been talking about this, because I'm concerned about prohibition, and there's an organization called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition.
Yes.
Jim Gierach, I've interviewed him multiple times, and he educated me about the origins of the drug war. In 1971, Richard Nixon declared war on drugs. He had his 4 schedules. He had all the drugs that were in those schedules. That, however, was a UN agenda. It had been enacted in 1961, and we now see that UN agenda applied globally. And it was the UN that started making the most noise when we first had these states say we're going to decriminalize marijuana, we're going to move beyond medical marijuana to decriminalization. It was the UN that was making the most noise about that. So conservatives need to understand that. And I think they also need to understand that this is not something that they really have a legal basis for. If we go back and we look at alcohol prohibition, Roger, we got only 20-some-odd amendments to the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, the 10 that are in there, and a couple of those have to do with prohibition. Why were those there? They maintain that they have a right at the federal government to regulate this because of the Commerce Clause, and yet the Commerce Clause was there before they had the constitutional amendment for prohibition of alcohol. So clearly, nobody in America believed that the Commerce Clause gave them the power to regulate that at the time. It didn't. And now we have a situation where they completely ignore the 10th Amendment. I mean, after the Commerce Clause was written, they had the 10th Amendment, the 9th and 10th Amendment, to make sure that the government wasn't going to grow out of its box that they had put it in with the Constitution. That was the view of the founders. But they have now gone to the position that everything is prohibited, and that includes prescription drugs, or the DEA, doing this, and you have all these different agencies, the FDA, the DEA, all telling us what types of drugs we can take. Everything is prohibited, even if you're dying from cancer. You can't take an experimental drug unless the FDA gives you permission to do that. So everything is prohibited unless they expressly permit it. It's an exact inversion of everything the Constitution was based on, and they have usurped this power.
It's very disturbing to me to hear the Attorney General say, good people don't use marijuana. No, Mr. Attorney General, sick people use marijuana.
Yeah.
Why does the federal government hold the patent on artificial THC if it has no medical value? The fact is the NIH studies of marijuana have systematically been flawed either by the dosages or the period. So those studies that are showing no medicinal value are rigged. They're rigged to show that. Anecdotally, however, you have millions and millions of Americans who have found relief from a number of maladies through the use of marijuana. I say go with the people, not the NIH studies, which have been rigged from the beginning.
Yeah, yeah. I think the other thing, too, Roger, is as we see the government ignore the Constitution and exceed the boundaries, we have seen them add things going after, during the Reagan administration, they decided to go after the end user heavily. So we had mandatory minimums, we had civil asset forfeiture. And now, as I mentioned earlier in the program, we've got all these different alphabet agencies like the EPA or the FAA saying, we're going to go out and we're going to hammer you with stuff. You don't have the presumption of innocence. We're going to take your property. You're going to have to sue us. And they're going down the same line of civil asset forfeiture. We've got a bill in Arizona that the governor has just signed for asset forfeiture reform. Now, it doesn't say that they have to charge you with a crime. It doesn't say that they have to convict you. That's why they call it civil. And what they did and called this reform, they said that it has to go from a preponderance of evidence to say that your property was somehow involved with drugs. Your property, your inanimate object, was somehow involved with drugs. So they had a preponderance standard. Now they've changed that to clear and convincing evidence. Why don't they go to the Sixth Amendment and say, we're going to have a conviction of this before we're going to take your property? That's the really bad thing. And the fact that they can steal it, you have to sue them in court, and most people don't have the money to do that.
Yeah, you know, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a political operative and therefore perhaps a political scientist. And I can tell you that if the administration, you know, essentially turns back the clock and we begin vigorous enforcement of marijuana, after the assurances of candidate Trump that he was a states' rights man on this issue, you will fracture the Trump coalition. You will shear off younger voters and libertarian-oriented voters, and this will be the end of Trumpism. I'm not sure the folks in Washington understand the political implications, never mind the medical and legal implications, but the political implications of what they're doing.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I want to look at one more thing. And, of course, we've got the Attorney General. You just heard the Homeland Security Secretary come out and say, you know, give his reefer madness speech. But I want you to hear what the drug czar had to say. And think about the fact that we're proud of calling somebody a drug czar. To me, I have always choked on that word. Why we would ever have anybody in government that we would proudly call a czar.
Yes.
We're talking about them dictating policy to us, and these are people that we didn't vote for. So these are unelected dictators that we have here. You know, as Jefferson said, we did not set this government up to have an elected dictatorship. Well, yeah, now we've got not just an elected dictator, but that they're pushing for by giving powers to the president and signing off on executive orders to the nth degree as they did with Obama. But now we've got a drug czar, and this is what this drug czar says. This is Tom Marino. He's a former representative from Pennsylvania, and he is the drug czar. He is a rabid hardliner, as Free Thought points out. And he has said that non-violent drug offenders should be placed in a hospital/prison. Let me read you the full quote that he has here. One treatment option I have advocated for years would be placing non-dealer, non-violent drug abusers in a secured hospital-type setting under constant care of health professionals. Once the person agrees to plead guilty to possession, he or she will be placed in an intensive treatment program until experts determine they should be released under intense supervision. This is taking civil asset forfeiture, where they confiscate your property without charging you with a crime, giving you a trial, convicting you. This is now where they confiscate you and they put you in a mental hospital. Maybe that's why they should call him a drug czar, because now we're getting to these Stalinist policies where they put people in mental hospitals until they can get them to turn around and do what they want to do, which is to confess to being a drug possessor.
This is extraordinary. I'm unfamiliar with Mr. Marino. I'm unfamiliar with his appointment. I have to question whether the president even knows that these are his views. For example, we have appointed a fellow, I believe his name is Epstein, although I'm not certain of that, as the head of the FDA, who is a mandatory vaxxer. I doubt the president is aware of his views. I know how this works. Reince Priebus comes in and he says, Mr. President, here's 15 appointments. Sign here. They're all qualified. These are good people. Yeah. And he signs.
That's right.
That's a mistake.
Yeah, you don't have time to vet all these. So even the top positions in all of these different bureaucracies, you don't have time to go through and look at all. You'll look at the Supreme Court appointment or something, but
sure.
You're not going to have the time to take a look at all these people who are going to be all the way down the bureaucracies of the drug prohibition machine.
Now in this case, Mr. Marino is on to something, which is that drug abuse should be treated as a public health problem, not a criminal problem. He's absolutely right. People need to be put into treatment who need help, but not on a mandatory incarcerated basis.
Not a hospital/prison.
Yes. So, I mean, there's a seed of a germ of a good idea here, but this is draconian, and this is the kind of thing that will get Donald Trump beat, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's switch the topic here to maybe the Export-Import Bank. This is something that has come up, and of course, we just had an article yesterday by Jerome Corsi talking about Senator Bob Corker, who he makes a case in a very long, lengthy article, a lot of documentation, how he has profited from Obamacare, from other insider trading, as so many people in both Republican and Democrat parties have profited from insider trading. When they got caught on it, of course, they put in the Stock Act until everybody lost interest, and then they gutted that, so it was no longer there. But Congress can profit from insider trading intensely. And now we have a situation with the Export-Import Bank. Now, going back to 2015, the Export-Import Bank was not renewed because the Senate did not replace two people on the board, and they didn't have a quorum, so they couldn't do anything. And Donald Trump talked about how it was feather bedding for large corporations, and it is. 60% of the money that is these subsidized loans, subsidized by taxpayers through the Export-Import Bank, 60% of that goes to, I think it's about a half dozen companies. 40% of it goes to Boeing to sell planes to companies like the United Arab Emirates. They actually have a national airline, this incredibly rich country, and many people have seen the city of Dubai, probably one of the wealthiest cities in the world. The police there drive supercars and hypercars. It's absolutely amazing that we would be subsidizing them buying airplanes, and that we would be subsidizing Mexico's oil company. These are state-owned corporations that we give massive loans to. But that is bad enough itself. But then we have one of the two people that Donald Trump is putting in for this Export-Import Bank is a guy who made a massive amount of money in the wake of the stock market meltdown that we had, the mortgage collapse. In 2008, they brought all the congressmen in. They had a meeting, and they said, put your cell phones over to the side. We don't want any of this information getting out. Well, the next day, Spencer Bacchus went in and put in $50,000 on stock options shorting the market that he'd just been told was going to drop in half. So this is one of the two individuals that Donald Trump would put in to revive the Export-Import Bank, something that most individuals don't really know what they're doing, but it is a poster child for crony capitalism. What do you think is going on with this?
Well, Dr. Corsi has done some really groundbreaking research in this area. I have to tell you, I know this firsthand, I believe Senator Corker may be the single most corrupt member of the United States Senate, that when he was briefly on the short list for vice president, the vetting done by the Trump campaign unearthed so much self-dealing, so much use of insider information that he learned as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and other committees, that his selection would have most definitely ended in the defeat of a Trump Corker ticket. This is why they call him the senator from Wells Fargo. And in all honesty, Dr. Corsi has just introduced the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the epic corruption of Senator Corker.
And it was a long article. I mean, just that tip was a very long article.
There is so much. I happen to know, for example, that the senator hectored a major automobile manufacturer to locate in Tennessee, and then his administrative assistant went out and purchased all the land around the location where they intend to put this automobile plant. You'll hear more about that shortly.
Yeah, we'll take a quick break and we'll come back, and I want to get your comments on Spencer Bacchus, because he was one guy that when Andrew Breitbart was still alive, he learned about that, and he says this guy needs to be forced out of Congress. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight with Roger Stone. We've got one more segment with Roger, and I want to get the information about where he's going to be tonight. He's going to be in Round Rock, and I want to get the details from that about that from you, Roger, in just a moment. But I want to remind the audience also that we have extended our Easter mega specials at InfoWarsStore.com. That is 25 to 30% off a wide variety of products. Things like Survival Shield X2 Nascent Iodine, 25% off. Super Male and Super Female Vitality, 25% off. 25% off Vitamin Mineral Fusion Drink and 25% off Secret 12. That's our vitamin B12 formulation. It's a great way to take vitamin B12. You just put it under your tongue instead of an injection. It's a great way to take your multivitamins and minerals by using the Vitamin Mineral Fusion Drink. You can just drink them instead of taking a lot of pills. All of those are 25% off, and we have 30% off Brain Force. So take a look at those specials. We've extended our Easter specials at InfoWarsStore.com, 25 to 35% off a wide variety of products. And Roger, you're going to be, we talked about this earlier, of course, your movie, the Netflix documentary about you, is going to be premiering at Tribeca this weekend, and it's a Netflix movie. It's going to be coming out in May, but you've got a book signing today at Round Rock.
Yeah, exactly. David, tonight I am at the Barnes & Noble in Round Rock here in the Austin area, starting at 6:30 this evening. It's at 2701 Parker Road. Now, if you don't live in the Austin area and therefore you can't make it, you could go to the InfoWarsStore.com right now and still get a copy of The Making of the President 2016, the inside story of how Donald Trump orchestrated an American revolution. I have signed, now at this point, thousands of books across the country. So I'll either see you tonight, but if you can't grab it tonight, if you can't make it tonight, go to the InfoWars store, because you can do two things. You can get a great book that I'm very proud of, but you can also help us continue the fight for freedom. We are being pummeled by Facebook, by Google. The manipulation of the algorithms here are really cutting our reach and our influence and our ability to network with other freedom-loving Americans. So
of course,
it's a win-win.
This is the book that Washington Post is attacking you at the top of the post today on their site. Roger Stone helped Donald Trump get elected president. Now he's helping himself. He's written a book. Who else have they ever criticized for writing a book? I mean, theoretically, this is the same business that the Washington Post is in. They criticize you for writing a book, but it's something that obviously they're very worried about, because they put you at the top. So people, if they want to know what the Washington Post is staying up at night worrying about when they're watching democracy dying in darkness, it's Roger Stone and his book.
Yeah, so it's actually win-win-win. You can help feed the Stone family. You can help strengthen InfoWars in the movement for freedom, and you can enjoy a great book that I think really will give you the inside story about how InfoWars and Breitbart and the Daily Caller and Town Hall and so many others were the vibrant, robust alternative media that opened the door to Donald Trump's election.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm really anxious to see that documentary about you, as you point out. 5 years in the making. So that's going to be a very interesting long-term perspective about what's been happening in politics for the last 5 years, because you've been at the heart of all that. Of course, you've got a couple of websites. Tell us about your websites,
Sure.
Stone Cold Truth.
Absolutely. You can go to stonecoldtruth.com to keep up with my doings. You can go to stonezone.com, which is more archival and historic. And then I would also urge you go to chargehillary.com. You know, the president gave a terrific interview with Maria Bartiromo of Fox Business News the other day. And very clearly, the prosecution of Hillary Clinton is back on the table. You see, David, no person is above the law.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We need